In this segment, I want to start to map out some of the genealogy of banking to try to understand where it first emerges and how it changes as it travels from one culture to another. So, to begin with, it's worth taking a look back pretty far in time, actually, to the Babylonian and other Mesopotamian empires. When we take a look back towards the early flourishing of large scale empires, one of the things we see once we move beyond city states is the need for trade financing. When people want to import tin from the Zagros Mountains, or they want to bring in lumber from the Anatolian highlands into the unforested flatlands of Mesopotamia, this kind of long distance trade necessarily requires financing. And so it's interesting to try to look at where the money came from to help finance these early kinds of trade operations. One of the earliest evidences we have of banking properly comes from a series of cuneiform tablets that have been dug up in old Babylonian and Sumerian city states. A lot of the cuneiform tablets that have been recovered archaeologically, in fact, are financial records. And this has given us a particularly deep insight into the way that commercial relations were organized during the Bronze Age. So if we take a look at one particular case that Goatsman discusses in Money Changes Everything, he tells us the story of Dumuzi Gamil, who lived approximately 38 centuries ago. And Dumuzi Gamil had borrowed extensively from the temple in Ur and had, or in Uruk, and had lent it out at much higher interest rates to other merchants effectively, engaging in business financing and small scale loan sharking within his own community. Now, over time, some of these intermediaries were quite successful in their lending and able to build up their own independent pools of wealth away from the temples and palaces and begin to engage in lending for their own purposes. And as they begin to accumulate expertise, they begin to develop a reputation as well, with other people seeking them out to make deposits with them so that they can then lend it out efficiently into other business ventures. One example of that is the banking house known as the Grandsons of Igebi, who prospered in Babylon for 7 generations before finally succumbing to bankruptcy of one form or another. The specific details of their demise are not made clear, but the House of Igebi was long-standing feature in Babylon and in the financial sector for almost 200 years. Now, once banking moves further afield, we see it emerging once again in Phoenicia on the Levantine coast. Mesopotamia had been conquered by the Akkadians from the north. The Akkadians themselves spread their culture out to the coast, fighting with the Egyptians and the Hittites in Anatolia. And unsurprisingly, the technologies of borrowing to lend came along with them. So we see the Phoenicians who have land frontage on the Mediterranean very quickly adapting these types of banking technologies. The idea of trade financing was particularly important to them as a maritime culture, because unlike the landlocked Akkadians or Babylonian civilizations, the Phoenicians, being a coastal civilization, literally turned the Mediterranean into their gigantic super trade basin. And we see that there are evidence of Phoenicians trading in Italy. We see evidence of the Phoenicians trading with the early Mycenaeans in Greece. We see that they colonized North Africa and Carthage, and may have even had colonies as far away as Iberia and modern Spain. Now, the Phoenicians, for several centuries, were the sort of masters of trade in the Mediterranean, thanks largely to having been able to sustain this sort of banking technology throughout the centuries. And even once their homeland is conquered in 539 by the invading Persians, their colony at Carthage retains commercial dominance over the Mediterranean for almost 4 more centuries until they finally run afoul of the Romans, who ultimately defeat them. Now, taking a look at some of the heirs to this banking technology in the Mediterranean, we see in classical Greece the emergence of what are called the TRAPEZITAI, or TRAPEZITAI. My Greek is terrible. My apologies to anyone who can speak it properly. But this was a group of individuals who are known for providing financing and lending. And they were known by, in particular, their tool, the trapeza, You can see an example of a or archaeological rendering of a trapeza, which was effectively a counting board or an early form of abacus that could be used as a mathematical aid, something that was particularly important for financiers who were working in the Athenian port of Piraeus, just outside of the city of Athens itself. Athens itself could not feed itself, as we'll discuss again later in the course, and was forced to engage in significant overseas trade in order to import the wheat that it needed. And therefore, Athens developed particularly complex and sophisticated financial tools to deal with this. Their laws include provisions for bankers. We see significant records of disputes that list things like shareholders or equity investors. There are disputes related to shipping insurance, leases on state properties, and even hiring professional lawyers to adjudicate some of these kinds of problems. So as it turns out, both finance and banking in particular were very well developed in classical Athens. And we actually see that there's archaeological evidence of this in the form of trapezas recovered from the ruins of Piraeus. Now, a little bit further to the west on the Italian peninsula, we see the Romans also adopting these kinds of techniques. Just as the Greeks inherited it from the Phoenicians, the Romans similarly inherited their techniques from the Greeks and Phoenicians and perhaps as well. Now, much like Athens, Rome could not feed itself, especially as its population grew dramatically, and therefore it had to rely on its access to the sea and grain imports, which meant unsurprisingly that their solution to the problem was very similar to the Athenian solution to the problem, involving things like long-distance trade and financing. So a lot of the same sorts of banking tools appear in early Republican Rome as well. We see that there are pawn shops in Rome that help to provide household credit. There are also more sophisticated banking operators who are working with merchants, taking deposits, making loans, transferring funds by ledger, exchanging currencies, and even negotiating bills of exchange between different traders. They're effectively the money merchants of ancient Rome that help to manage the plumbing of international trade that is the lifeblood of the city. Another example of this kind of early financing actually occurs in the writings of Roman Senator Cicero, whose neighbor bought 600 acres of land for 11.5 million sesterces and completed the transaction not with coin, but via ledger and using credit. During the Roman period, large temples like the Temple of Saturn or the Temple of Juno Moneta were acted as important financial centers. In fact, Juno Moneta is actually where we get the English word money from. And on top of this, the Romans ran a public bank, which would offer collateralized loans to affluent citizens, mostly in the form of reverse mortgages. But we do see that under under Augustus, the Roman state was even willing to offer this kind of collateralized loans themselves to the poor. So we see to some extent that there is a hole in the banking structure whereby there is a significant underbanked community in the Republican era, even though the wealthy definitely have access to these kinds of technologies. Now, unfortunately, for the most part, as the Roman Empire collapses, a lot of these technologies necessarily get lost. There are a lot of difficult changes that take place throughout what's known as the early medieval period or the Dark Ages. But by the time we start to move towards the late Middle Ages or the early Renaissance, we begin to see banking technology starting to reemerge and providing a significant shot to the re-emerging economies in Europe.